So I'd like to start by thanking the Oxford Hayek Society for having me here, and all of you for coming. This is actually my first time really speaking at Oxford in over 20 years. Since I was a high school student, I spent the summer here at a summer program, so the speeches I gave then weren't nearly as well attended as this one, so I will try to live up to the perhaps unrealistically high expectations. So we already have technical difficulties here. You said I clicked the right?
Left.
Wow.
Left is, yeah. Just
Okay, that's not actually
click.
doing much. Okay, so
Try listening. And try just clicking. Yeah, left.
okay,
left
so
works.
actually, I know
Left
how to do it.
works.
What we need to do is we need to advance the mouse over here,
Yeah.
and then left will work.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so now that the technical difficulties are mostly over with, we'll go on, as it must. In Hollywood, they tell you you have to pretend like the technical difficulties are not going on, but when they're sufficiently blatant in their nature, then it's hard to pretend. So instead, I will focus attention on the golden retriever on the screen, which exemplifies the problem to which my book is devoted, the problem of political choice. Notice that Will, the golden retriever, is up there with a donkey and an elephant, the symbols of the Democrats and the Republicans, and the key question is, does she have enough information to make an informed choice about which of these parties to support? Now, in the case of Willow, she actually knows a great deal about politics and government and public policy, so we can be pretty sure that she is going to make an informed choice. Unfortunately, in the case of the vast majority of the electorate, that often is not the case.
But it's, you need to click left, not the scroll button.
Okay. So it's just this left button, all right.
Yeah.
So in the case of the vast majority electorate, often it's not the case that they have enough information to make a good decision. So in the presentation, as in the book, I'll start out by talking a little bit about why political ignorance matters, why we should care about this problem. Then I'll talk somewhat briefly about the extent of ignorance, how it's actually quite profound and most of the public knows relatively little about politics. Now, many people would assume that if the public is ignorant, it must be the result of stupidity or the result of information not being available to them. But in reality, that's not the main cause. In reality, for most people, it's actually rational to know very little about politics and government and pay little attention to it. Some scholars argue that we don't need to worry very much about political ignorance because actually people have information shortcuts that enable them to vote in an informed way, even if they don't know very much. I'm going to suggest that while these shortcuts are sometimes useful, most of the time they're not nearly as effective as advocates claim that they are, and some of the time they actually make the situation worse rather than better. Given this situation that there is widespread political ignorance and shortcuts may not be very effective, some people have argued that we can actually just increase political information relatively easily, perhaps through education or through some other means. I'm going to suggest that actually this is a much more difficult task than most scholars believe, and in reality it's unlikely that we're going to get a major increase in political knowledge anytime soon. In the last parts of the presentation, I'm going to suggest some ways that we can more effectively live with the political ignorance out there, namely that we can do better in terms of both acquiring information and using it in a rational way when we vote with our feet rather than at the ballot box, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means and why it's actually better from an informational point of view. I'll also discuss why widespread political ignorance has important implications for the institution of judicial review. In effect, it strengthens the case for having strong judicial review to limit the powers of government in various ways. Most of my book is focused on political ignorance in the United States. However, it does have some implications for other countries, and in today's presentation, I will talk briefly about how the political ignorance problem in Britain actually is in many ways strikingly similar to that in the US. If we can now finally successfully move on with our slides, yay, the first effective transition from one slide to another. We asked the question of why political ignorance matters. Some people, like the individual up on the screen right now, they think that political ignorance shouldn't matter because voting is just a personal choice. It's an exercise of your personal freedom, and therefore if you want to vote in an uninformed way, that's your right, just as, for example, it may be your right to eat an unhealthy diet because you're ignorant about the consequences, or it may be your right to have a lifestyle where you're a couch potato and you don't exercise ever. You may not know that that's bad for you, but it's still perhaps your right to, in effect, make that decision in ignorance. I think John Stuart Mill effectively refuted this kind of argument with respect to voting in his classic book, Considerations on Representative Government, where he pointed out that voting is not just a personal choice. It is, as he put it, the exercise of power over others. When we elect people to rule over us, they don't just govern those who voted for them, they govern all the rest of society as well, and therefore, in effect, we inflict our ignorance when we vote not just on ourselves, but on other members of society, and that makes it very different from some of these other more purely personal decisions that I just mentioned. In addition, political ignorance does have often a negative effect on government policy. In democratic societies, public opinion has a big impact on what government does. Of course, it's not the only factor that has an impact, but studies repeatedly show that it does have a big effect. So ignorant voting can also lead to ignorant and harmful government policy, and that's generally speaking a bad thing. Even if all you care about is the majority achieving its own particular objectives, and you argue that they don't have any reason to be concerned about the interests of the minority, even so, if the majority of the people have low levels of political knowledge, they might actually choose leaders who adopt counterproductive policies from the standpoint of the majority's own goals. So even from that narrow viewpoint, political ignorance can be a serious problem. So the question that arises, how serious a problem is it actually? And probably the least controversial part of my book is chapter 1, where I document the enormous extent of political ignorance that exists in the United States today. I'm not going to go into all of the many details in the book, but I will just give a few examples from recent American political history. So obviously, as many of you probably know, even those of you who are not Americans, over the last 3 or 4 years, one of the most controversial issues in American politics has been the fate of Obamacare, the president's health care law adopted in 2010. Yet a poll conducted in August found that some 44% of the public don't even realize that Obamacare is still the law. Similarly, some 80% in September said that they had heard little or nothing about the health insurance exchanges, which are a central feature of that law, even though obviously they're very controversial and they have been much debated in the media and elsewhere over the last couple of years. Another major policy problem on the political agenda over the last several years in the United States, like in many European countries, is the question of the fiscal crisis that we have been undergoing, with the government spending a lot more money than it takes in. So that has raised the question of what, if anything, should be cut, should taxes be raised, and the like. Yet polls repeatedly show that most of the American public has very little idea of how the federal government actually spends its money. So for instance, they greatly underestimate the percentage that's spent on major entitlement programs like Medicare, Social Security, and others, even though these are among the largest portions of the federal budget, but they overestimate by a factor of 5 or 10 the percentage of the budget that's spent on foreign aid, actually only about 1%, but it seems as if the average voter believes that if only the United States could cut foreign aid, then its fiscal problems would be solved. In reality, whatever you think of foreign aid, even if the U.S. completely abolished foreign aid tomorrow, the fiscal problem would be of roughly the same magnitude as it currently is. This ignorance applies not just to particular policy issues, but even to the basic structure of government. So, for example, a 2006 poll found that only 42% of the American public can name the 3 branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And similarly, as I'll discuss in a little bit more detail later in my presentation, often the public is confused about which government officials are responsible for which issues. So as a result, they often end up rewarding and punishing officials for performance on issues that they often can't have an impact on. Now, when I give data like this, sometimes people say, well, it must be the fault of the X generation, the young people today who are out playing video games, watching Miley Cyrus videos, and not learning about political affairs in the way that people in my generation did. But in reality, the survey data shows that the level of political knowledge in the United States has been fairly stable over the last 50 or 60 years, virtually the entire period for which we have modern public opinion data. So it doesn't seem to be the case that it's one particular generation that is responsible for this. There is a lot of ignorance in the younger generation, but there's also a lot of ignorance in the generations before it as well. However, in a couple of ways, the problem of political ignorance has become worse over the last several decades. One is that today government is larger and more complicated than it used to be. In the United States, government spending at all levels is around 40% of gross domestic product. In many European countries, it's even higher than that, and that doesn't take into account of many other activities of government, such as regulation and the like, that don't necessarily occur entirely on budget. So even though levels of political knowledge are roughly the same as they were several decades ago, that limited amount of knowledge is spread out over a wider range of issues, and therefore is perhaps even less adequate than it used to be. In addition, it's striking that political knowledge levels have remained stable for many years, even as education levels have risen, and also information has become more freely available than ever before, thanks to the internet and other forms of modern technology. Therefore, as it turns out, while the actual level of knowledge is roughly the same as several decades ago, in some ways the problem is more severe than it had been in the past. Now, you may well ask, well, if this is true for the United States, what about other countries? It's very difficult to make precise international comparisons about political knowledge, because different countries have somewhat different political systems, and so I can't tell you for certain whether in the United States the problem is slightly worse than in Europe, or slightly better, or about the same. However, the data that we do have on European countries are at least suggestive in that the problems seem to be similar, if not exactly alike. Indeed, recent data from the United Kingdom is actually very strikingly similar to data in the United States, according to a poll conducted by Ipsos Mori just this past summer. So Ipsos, for example, found that in Britain, as in the United States, most of the public greatly underestimates the percentage of the budget that is spent on various entitlement programs such as pensions. They, like Americans, greatly overestimate the percentage that's spent on foreign aid. British poll respondents, like American ones, tend to overestimate the number of immigrants in the population, and also overestimate the budgetary costs that immigrants may inflict on society. And interestingly, in both the United States and Britain, the majority of people consistently say that crime is rising, even though in fact for the last 15 to 20 years it's been fairly consistently falling. This has implications for the kinds of crime policies and law enforcement policies that people are likely to support, so it's a potentially important error. So it's striking to me, looking at the British data compared to the American, it's not just that there's ignorance in both countries, but the type of ignorance that there is in a direction of it seems very similar across a wide range of issues. There's also some similar data for continental European countries, though I'm somewhat less familiar with the evidence for that. So in hearing data like this, a lot of people assume that it must be the result of stupidity. If only people were not idiots, if only if they were as smart as we were, they would know more. Or alternatively, maybe the problem is that the information just isn't available. So maybe the media isn't reporting about politics correctly, maybe powerful nefarious forces are hiding the truth from us, but if only it were revealed, then the public would become aware of what's going on. I think neither one of these explanations holds scrutiny. if you look at actual data on IQ scores and intelligence levels, strikingly, IQ has actually been going up over the last 50 to 60 years in both the United States and Europe, so it's not the case that people are stupid. Some people certainly are stupid, but political ignorance can't be explained by that, especially in an era when intelligence levels have actually been rising. Similarly, it's not plausible to argue that the problem is that the information isn't available. To the contrary, especially with basic political knowledge, that information is readily available both in the media and in other sources, and indeed with the internet, it's actually more available than it's ever before been in all of human history, so that seems like not a plausible explanation either. So what is the actual cause of the problem here? For most people, the cause is that it's actually rational behavior to spend little or no time following politics and learning about political issues. Let's imagine that your only reason to learn about politics is to make a more informed decision at the ballot box to decide whether you prefer the Democrats or the Republicans, or in this country, the Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, or Labor. That turns out not to be much of an incentive at all, because the chance that your vote will actually make a difference in an election is extremely small. In an American presidential election, it's about 1 in 60 million. In a British election, it's more complicated because of the different nature of the British political system, but nonetheless, realistically, the chance is very low. It turns out that for most people, it's actually rational to devote very little time to acquiring political knowledge, because the chance that their knowledge will make a difference is extremely small. Now, of course, most people don't know these exact odds, 1 in 60 million, or whatever the odds are in Britain. However, they do have an intuitive sense that studying political knowledge is not an activity that's likely to have a very high payoff. It's not likely to make a difference, and therefore they devote very little time and effort to it. And thus, even though the information is freely available, at least for the most part, people don't take the time and effort to learn it. The real constraint here is not the supply of information, but the demand for it. Now, of course, there are some people who learn about various phenomena and activities not because they want to make a difference to outcomes, but because they actually enjoy it. So I created this slide just for the presentation in Britain. These people follow soccer, or football as you call it in this country, even though it's unlikely that they'll make a difference to the outcome of games, but they enjoy learning about their favorite team, here the English national team, and they enjoy cheering for it against its rivals, and they also enjoy being part of a community of fellow fans. So you have sports fans out there who learn a lot about sports, even though there's little chance that they will affect the outcome of games. And similarly, in addition to sports fans, we have political fans, people who enjoy learning about politics for similar reasons. They enjoy following it, they find it entertaining, they enjoy cheering on your favorite party or ideology or candidate against their opponents, and like these people, they enjoy being part of a community of fellow political fans. Now, I think there's nothing wrong with being either a sports fan or a political fan. Indeed, I'm both to some extent. I think it's great entertainment some of the time, and certainly for people who are very committed fans, they do end up acquiring a lot more political knowledge than the average voter does. But there is a problem. When you acquire information for the purposes of being a fan, that objective is often inimical to the goal of truth-seeking. So if you think about sports fans and how they react to any call that goes against their team, they say it must be a terrible call, it's absolutely a mistake, but on the other hand, if it goes in favor of their team, they say, oh, of course that was a correct call. So political fans, when they react to political information, react much the same way as sports fans do to new sports information. They tend to ignore or undervalue any information that goes against their pre-existing views, whereas they overvalue anything that seems to reinforce them. Indeed, the data suggests that people who are particularly interested in politics, that is the ones who are the biggest political fans, they tend to also talk about politics only with other people who agree with their point of view, and they also tend to follow political media that agree with that viewpoint as well. Now, from the standpoint of truth-seeking, this is highly irrational behavior. As John Stuart Mill famously pointed out, if you're really seeking the truth, what you want to do is you want to seek out information sources that go against your pre-existing views, because those are the ones that are more likely to tell you arguments and evidence that you haven't heard of before. But from the standpoint of enjoying the fan experience, it turns out that this is very rational. It's painful and unpleasant to hear opposing points of view often. On the other hand, it's enjoyable to hear your own pre-existing viewpoint confirmed, and so from the standpoint of being a fan, it's actually entirely rational to behave this way. This is why Brian Kaplan, a well-known economist, calls it rational irrationality. When the goal of acquiring information is not primarily to seek the truth, but to achieve some other kind of objective, it turns out that it's rational to be illogical in the kinds of information sources you use, and also to be highly biased in your evaluation of the information that you get. So ultimately, what we end up with here is a situation where most people who are not political fans, they know very little about politics and government. Of those who know more than the average person, who relatively speaking know a lot, a high proportion of them are political fans who are very biased in their evaluation of that information. So therefore you have a two-level problem, which is extremely severe, both with most people being relatively ignorant and also with them doing a poor job of processing the political information that they do know. Now, some scholars argue that we nonetheless don't need to worry very much about the problem of political ignorance, because we have lots of information shortcuts available to us where we can take small bits of information and substitute them for larger bodies of knowledge that we don't know very much about. In the book, I devote an entire chapter to many different shortcut theories. Here, I'll just point out a few that are particularly prominent in the literature. One is the idea of opinion leaders. Maybe you and I don't know very much about politics, but we know other people who do, and therefore instead of making decisions for ourselves, we can just ask who they think we should vote for, what policies they think we should support, and so forth, and follow their example. Maybe, for instance, I could consult Willow the golden retriever, whom you saw in the first slide in this presentation where we had the technical difficulties, or you might have some other opinion leader that you prefer to follow. Another possibility, the one that's most often seen in the literature and that has perhaps the most support, is this idea exemplified by a famous quote by Ronald Reagan from the 1980 US presidential election. Reagan says, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago when Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976. He says, if you were better off, then maybe you should vote for Carter and reward him for his seemingly good performance. If, on the other hand, you're worse off, and most people at that time thought they were worse off, then you should vote for the challenger, who just happened to be Reagan himself." So it was sort of a self-serving comment, but the idea is that maybe we don't need to know much about the details of government policy. We just have to ask, are things getting better under the incumbents, or are they getting worse? If they're getting better, we reward the incumbents, they continue their good policies. If, on the other hand, they're getting worse, we can vote to throw the bastards out, as people say in the United States. And once we've thrown them out, we can elect a different set of bastards to take their place. But the new bastards will have good incentives to adopt effective policies, because they will know that if things keep on getting worse, we can then throw them out in their turn. So this is the idea of retrospective voting. I think this shortcut and others like it have some utility, and sometimes they are effective, but their effectiveness tends to be overstated. And indeed, retrospective voting, the idea exemplified by this quote by Reagan, actually also exemplifies some of the shortcomings of these shortcuts, which is, by the way, the title of the relevant chapter in my book, The Shortcomings of Shortcuts. I hope it's catchy. In any event, one big problem is that in order to use these shortcuts effectively, you often need pre-existing knowledge about what's going on, and in this case, about which issues the particular government officials you're voting on can actually have an effect on. And it turns out that often the public doesn't know that. In most elections, both in the United States and elsewhere in the Western world, the biggest factor is short-term economic conditions. How is the economy doing this year or over the last year or two? But in reality, most economists would point out that usually government officials have very little ability to affect short-term economic conditions. either for good or for ill. If they could affect them, incumbents would almost never be defeated for re-election because they would simply find a way to pump up the economy in the few months right before they come up for re-election. But in reality, their ability to affect these things is very limited, and therefore what we end up doing is in effect rewarding and punishing incumbents for things they didn't cause. This problem is not limited to economic voting. It occurs with a wide range of issues. For instance, in the United States, in farm states, in a year where there's a drought and the drought reduces farm production, that's very bad news for the political incumbents, the governor and the legislators. They would tend to be punished at the polls, even though their ability to affect whether a drought occurs or not is extremely limited. Similarly, I mentioned sports fans before. Sports has a connection to electoral politics as well. If the local sports team is victorious in a major championship or the like, that makes it more likely that the mayor and other local officials will be reelected, even though, generally speaking, they have very little chance of affecting these things. It's even the case that in coastal communities, if shark attacks suddenly occur, if Jaws comes up and takes a bite out of somebody, I'm not sure if this generation still watches the movie Jaws, but it's a famous movie from the 1970s about a shark who gobbles people up. So if Jaws surfaces and takes a bite, that's bad news for political incumbents in the area as well. They will tend to get blamed and be less likely to win re-election. And there are many other similar examples that I can give. So the bottom line is much of the public doesn't actually have the kind of knowledge you need to engage in effective retrospective voting. In addition, the other big problem with shortcuts, other than that you need pre-existing knowledge, is that often, in order to use them effectively, you need to overcome the rational irrationality, the bias that I was speaking of earlier, and much of the time, instead of choosing shortcuts for the purpose of getting at the truth, people instead choose these shortcuts because they're entertaining or because they reinforce their pre-existing biases. So I mentioned earlier the opinion leader idea. If you look at the most popular opinion leaders, both in the United States and in most other countries I'm familiar with, you find that the most popular opinion leaders are not policy experts who know a lot about issues and have an excellent track record of predicting the effects of different government policies. Rather, they're people who tend to be entertainers more than anything else, who are good at entertaining people and also reinforcing the audience's pre-existing views. I can mention a couple examples from the United States, such as Jon Stewart and Rush Limbaugh. There are similar people in European countries who are very popular opinion leaders, but whatever their other virtues, it doesn't seem like their main skill is their vast knowledge of government and public policy. And the same point can be made, not just about this shortcut, but about many others, including retrospective voting. The idea of retrospective voting implicitly assumes that you judge the incumbent based on what is going on in the world, but in reality, often people judge what's going on in the world based on how they feel about the incumbent. So, for instance, when a Democrat is in the White House, Republican voters tend to overestimate the rate of inflation and unemployment, and Democratic voters tend to have the opposite kind of bias. Similar results have been found with studies with European voters as well. So I think these shortcuts overall can be useful in various situations, but given the public's low level of knowledge and the poor job they often do of evaluating the information they do have, often the shortcuts are either ineffective or sometimes actually make things worse. For instance, if you choose an opinion leader who is entertaining and interesting, but actually very unreliable in their judgment of actual policy issues. So what can we do about this problem? Many people would say if the problem is ignorance, the most obvious solution is education. We should educate people to learn more about politics. Perhaps, for instance, we shouldn't let them get a high school diploma unless they pass a political knowledge test or other sorts of strategies similar to that. The problem is that over the last 50 or 60 years, average education levels have risen enormously. The average American today has something like 2 or 3 more years of formal education than the average American of 50 or 60 years ago, yet political knowledge levels have not risen. And that suggests to me that it's actually much more difficult to increase political knowledge through education than many people might think that it is. Now you might say, well, the problem is they have the wrong school curriculum. If only they were teaching the right things, then political knowledge really would go up. And in principle, I think that might be true. If you really did teach the right things and gave people strong incentives to learn them, then maybe that would raise political knowledge. The problem is, what's the incentive of actual real-world governments to actually do that? For the most part, the incentive is very weak. To be sure, if the voters closely monitored education policy and made sure to punish government officials at the polls if they didn't actually increase political knowledge through that education policy, then things might be very different. But if the voters were that well informed, we probably wouldn't have a political ignorance problem in the first place. In addition, throughout the history of public education in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, governments have often actually used it to indoctrinate the public in their own preferred viewpoints rather than trying to increase its knowledge. In Europe, public education was initially introduced in large part to indoctrinate people in nationalism. In the United States, it was often introduced to indoctrinate Catholic immigrants in a more Protestant sort of worldview. Catholics were considered a serious threat to the American way in the 19th and early 20th century, and I can tell similar stories about education in other countries. Obviously today, the nature of public school indoctrination for the most part is not the same as it was in the 19th century, but governments and also various interest groups still tend to show more interest in using education for indoctrination purposes than in using it to increase political knowledge in some sort of a neutral way. Moreover, even if the government did try hard to use education to increase political knowledge and resisted the temptation to indoctrinate, there is still the problem of the immense size and scope of government that exists today. So even if the public knew more than it currently does, thanks to better education, their knowledge might still be inadequate to keep track of the enormous complexity of government that we currently have in both the US and other Western nations. Now, the other strategy that many people propose to raise political knowledge is media reform. If only the media covered politics in the right way, if only they produced more hard news as opposed to sort of fluffy news about the doings of Miley Cyrus and other entertainment stars, then maybe people would know more about politics. I think this theory has even less to commend it than the idea that we can greatly increase political knowledge for education, because as I noted before, political information is actually already very widely available, both through the media and through a wide range of other sources, particularly on the internet. The problem is not that the hard news isn't out there. The problem is that most of the public doesn't want to spend more than a minimal amount of time watching hard news. In the United States, there is actually a network called C-SPAN, which 24 hours a day shows all kinds of very detailed political news. I think at least some European countries have similar networks, and some people do watch C-SPAN regularly. I actually watch it sometimes myself, but the vast majority of the public says I'd rather watch Miley Cyrus or sports or other kinds of things. So even if we had more stations like C-SPAN, it's unlikely that most of the public would actually take advantage of them. So another seemingly obvious way to increase political information, but one that actually hasn't been brought up much until I wrote about it in my book, is that if the problem is that people don't have enough incentive to learn about politics, why not give them an incentive? Why not pay them to learn political information? For example, we can have an annual political knowledge test that's administered by the government, and anybody who gets a high enough score will get a certain payment. So in principle, I think this idea deserves more research and consideration. If it worked, it really would raise political knowledge enormously. Indeed, small-scale studies suggest that when you give people political knowledge tests and give them a little bit of time to search for the answers, if you pay them for correct answers, the rate of correct answers greatly increases, even if you pay them only a little bit of money, such as $1 or $2 per correct answer. So in principle, this strategy has a lot of potential, but there is a serious problem. The serious problem that I at least haven't been able to figure out a way to solve, which is why I don't actually recommend this until we solve the problem. The problem is that the government would have to figure out what questions will be on the test and what the correct answers are. And obviously that means that there will be a lot of opportunity for bias. If, for instance, the Republicans were in power, they would try to bias the test in their favor and against Democrats, and vice versa. And similarly with most European political parties, if they could have such a test in their countries. So I think this idea deserves more research. Perhaps some of you here at Oxford will figure out a way around this difficulty, but until we do solve it, I don't actually recommend it, though I think it is at least an interesting idea, though I know I would say that because I actually came up with it, but maybe some of you will develop the idea better than I have. So until that happens, what can we actually do about political ignorance? And I suggest that, this is actually the slide that should have been next. These are the ideas for, more conventional ideas for raising political knowledge, but what I actually suggest is this, voting with your feet. This is immigrants to the United States arriving at Ellis Island about 100 years ago. They're voting with their feet for what they hope are better political and economic conditions in the US as opposed to the countries that they came from. And in the book, I discuss two types of voting with your feet. One is when you vote with your feet between different political jurisdictions. It could be between two different nations, but more commonly between different jurisdictions within the same nation, such as a different local government or a different state or regional government. You can also vote with your feet in the private sector. For example, when you buy a new product as opposed to an old one, or when you deal with different civil society organizations and the like. Indeed, often in the private sector, you can vote with your feet without actually moving anywhere at all. So why would this be any better than voting at the ballot box? After all, when you vote with your feet, you still need information to do it, so maybe it's just as bad as voting at the ballot box. I think the big reason why it might be better is that when you vote with your feet, you have much stronger incentives to acquire necessary information. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time acquiring political information the last time you chose what car to buy or what TV to buy than the last time you decided who to vote for President of the United States if you're an American, or for any government official in your home country if you come from somewhere else. Now, is this because your car or your TV is actually more important than who rules your country, or because the TV deals with more complicated issues than the government of your country does? I think probably not. It's rather that when you chose what TV to buy, you knew that your decision would actually make a difference. Whereas when you vote at the ballot box, while you may not know the exact odds, you have at least an intuitive sense that the odds are pretty low that it'll make a difference. So the decision that will make a difference, you tend to take much more seriously than a decision that will not. This applies not just to rational ignorance, your incentive to acquire information, but also to your incentive to effectively use the information that you do get. So consider this social norm that exists at least in the United States, that you're not supposed to argue about politics in mixed company. If you come up to somebody and you start explaining why their political views are wrong, even if you have devastating arguments and you prove that what they believe is totally wrong and you're completely correct, they probably won't thank you for enlightening them. Indeed, I know from personal experience that they won't. The more powerful your arguments are, often the more angry they will get. On the other hand, if you give somebody relevant information about a foot voting decision, what car to buy, what TV to buy, what town might be good to live in, they might not necessarily be grateful to you, but on average, they will react less negatively than when you give them new political information, because even though they might not like being proven wrong, they at least recognize that the information you're giving to them might be useful for decisions that will actually make a difference. The bottom line is people react less rationally to new political information because hearing political information that goes against your existing views, for most people, is all pain for very little gain. You have the embarrassment of being shown up and shown that you don't know as much as you thought, but you have very little benefit because the chance that your new knowledge will actually make a difference is very low. On the other hand, with knowledge that's relevant to foot voting decisions, your chances are at least significantly greater that the knowledge will actually be useful to you. Now, this is true not just as a matter of theory, but indeed in many historical examples where we see people acquiring the information that they need to vote with their feet, and in doing so effectively even under highly adverse conditions. Obviously, the people who immigrated to the United States 100 years ago, this is an example of that. In many cases, those people were poor or even illiterate in their own languages, yet they acquired sufficient information to realize that conditions might be better in this very far away destination. In American history, a good example is the case of African Americans a century ago, millions of whom moved from the southern states to the north, where policies, although still racist, were less racist than in the South, even though many of these African Americans were also illiterate, had very low levels of education, and southern state governments deliberately tried to keep them from learning about better conditions elsewhere. Nonetheless, millions of them were able to make those decisions effectively and acquire the knowledge that they needed. Certainly this did not do away by any means with the problem of racism, but it enabled them to make it less painful and severe for them than it might have been if they couldn't vote with their feet at all. Obviously, under modern conditions, acquiring information for foot voting is a lot easier for most people than it was a century ago, both because people are more educated and because the information itself is more freely available. So this is also true, of course, for foot voting in the private sector, where there's an enormous amount of information and where also moving costs are often significantly lower. Now, obviously, voting with your feet does have problems of its own, and in the book I discuss three of the most commonly mentioned ones. The most obvious is the problem of moving costs, whereas going to the ballot box usually takes little time and effort in and of itself. Moving to a different jurisdiction, a different city, or a different region often does have significant moving costs. I think this is a genuine problem. However, it's not as bad as many people would say that it is. Over the last, in recent decades, the data suggests that some 43% of Americans have moved from one state to another at least once in their lives, and some 63% have moved either interstate or within the same state. There is also increasing mobility between different countries in the European Union and elsewhere in the world. Moreover, to the extent that moving costs are a problem, we can diminish them in a couple of ways. One is the costs of moving from one city to another are usually less than those of moving from one region to another. So if we decentralize political power to lower levels of government, then moving costs would be lower, and they're lower still if in fact decisions are made in the private sector rather than in government. Often if you want to vote with your feet in the private sector, you don't have to move at all, as for instance if you choose to buy a new car, a new TV, or a new private sector service provider for any number of other kinds of purposes, you often don't have to move at all. So in the United States, perhaps the biggest historical objection to political decentralization is the belief that it leads to the oppression of various minority groups. I mentioned African Americans before, but it's also thought to lead to the oppression of some other groups as well, such as gays and lesbians, for example. And the idea is if you decentralize power, this just empowers whoever is the local majority, and they will oppress minority groups perhaps quite severely. So even if voting with your feet might be beneficial for the majority, it's likely to actually harm or at least not benefit minority groups. I think, at least in American history, this is true to some extent. There is a long history of the oppression of minority groups by state and local governments. However, this conventional wisdom is overstated even for the US, and I think it has, in some ways, even less applicability to other countries. One way in which it's overstated is that the conventional wisdom ignores the fact that it wasn't just state and local governments that oppressed minority groups. The federal government often did so as well. So, for instance, at the time the United States was founded, in the late 18th century, the federal government at that time and for many years thereafter did a lot more to promote and protect slavery than it did to abolish it. Similarly, the federal government has a history of oppressing a number of other minority groups as well in American history. Indeed, at many points in American history, it probably would have been worse for minorities, or even worse if we had a single unified policy on racial issues than federalism was. For example, if at the time of the founding there had been a single unified policy on slavery, that would have probably meant that every state was a slave state, because at that time only 1 or 2 states had already abolished slavery. Similarly, if in the early 20th century there was a unified policy on racial segregation, that policy would probably have looked much more like the policy of the southern states and that of the northern ones. For example, during that time, the District of Columbia, where Washington, D.C. is located, the only part of the country which at that time the federal government had complete control over, the District of Columbia was in fact almost totally racially segregated, just like the South was. So I don't think that's a perfect indication of what policy would have been throughout the nation had the federal government been in complete control, but it's certainly at least somewhat suggestive. Moreover, federalism at various points in American history has actually benefited minorities. The principal way is by enabling them to vote with their feet, as I mentioned in the case of African Americans. Now, it is certainly not my claim that the opposite of the conventional wisdom is true. That is that decentralization is always what's best for unpopular minority groups. I think it depends on the situation, and we can talk in more detail in the questions if you're interested in this question. But I also think that at the very least, the problem of the oppression of minorities is not a blanket argument for rejecting federalism and political decentralization, and it's especially not outside the American context, where in many countries you have groups that are minorities at the national level being concentrated in particular regions, so the national minority often is actually the local majority. This is rarely true in the United States, but it is often true in many other federal systems, and therefore in those instances you don't even have this kind of trade-off at all between political decentralization and the interests of minorities. They actually, in many ways, actually go together in those countries. A third objection that is often made against political decentralization is the concern that it might lead to a so-called race to the bottom. So the fear is that state or local governments, what they want to do is attract business interests that will pay more taxes. And so the way they'll do that is they'll, for instance, gut environmental standards or adopt other perverse policies which benefit business but harm the rest of the public in some way. I think, therefore, if that is actually what happens, then voting with your feet might be illusory because, while it might be beneficial for business interests, it'll be a false choice for everybody else. It is not my view that this kind of problem never arises, but I think it, like the other two objections that I just covered, tends to be overblown. In particular, it ignores the fact that many of the terrible things that local or state governments supposedly will do to benefit business are actually things that will deter other people from migrating in who they want to attract. So, for instance, consider the case of environmental policy. Most people prefer to live in places that have a relatively nice environment, have relatively clean air, and so forth. Indeed, even business interests often prefer this. Why? Because they want to attract productive workers to work in their businesses, and particularly middle and upper middle class workers, they do care about this, and as a result, states actually have an incentive to take account of environmental issues and other similar issues that will be of interest to potential migrants. And indeed, in American history, many forms of environmental protection were actually first pioneered by state governments rather than by the federal government. So there are other similar examples that I could give for why the race to the bottom theory is often either wrong or overblown, but for now I will simply suggest that it ignores this crucial factor that it assumes that states compete only to attract businesses, but in fact they compete to attract workers and taxpayers as well, and many of those people actually care about the very kinds of bad things that it is claimed that the states might do to attract nefarious business interests. So what are the implications of this for what we should do? I think the implication is that we should have greater political decentralization and also tighter limits on government power than we might otherwise support. If political power is decentralized, that strengthens the ability of people to vote with their feet. They can vote with their feet on more issues. And the same thing is true if the power of the public sector generally is more limited. We can vote with our feet than in the private sector, which, as I noted, has even lower moving costs often than doing so between different divisions of government, whether state governments or local governments or the like. Now, I emphasize that political knowledge and the problems it causes are certainly not the only factor that you should consider in deciding how large or how complicated government should be or how decentralized it should be, but it's an important factor that too rarely gets considered. So it is not my claim that if you read this book and you agree with everything that I say, unlikely as that might be, even if you agree with everything I say, you won't necessarily be as libertarian as I might be, but you probably would be more libertarian than perhaps you would be otherwise if you thought that political ignorance were not a serious problem. In the very last part of the presentation, I'd like to talk briefly about the implications of political ignorance for my particular branch of academia, law and judicial review. In the United States and in many other countries, a principal argument against judicial review is what American academics call the counter-majoritarian difficulty. The problem that when judges overrule laws passed by legislatures, they are supposedly being anti-democratic, they're going against the will of the majority of the people, and that may be a bad thing. Once you take political ignorance as seriously as a problem, it turns out that the counter-majoritarian difficulty is less severe than we might otherwise think it is, and it indeed turns out that judicial review can sometimes strengthen political accountability by diminishing the impact of ignorance. If the public, generally speaking, is ignorant of much of what government does, then that suggests that many of the laws judges might strike down are actually laws that the public either didn't know about or had little or no understanding of their effects, and that at the very least greatly diminishes the extent to which striking down those laws might be anti-democratic in a meaningful way. In addition, judicial review can actually help mitigate the problems of political ignorance and in that way perhaps actually strengthen political accountability. And it can do this in a couple of different ways. One is if judicial review, for instance, limits the power of the central government and leaves more issues to be determined by state or local governments or by the private sector, then that enables people to make more decisions by voting with their feet, which is a situation where they have better incentives to be well informed. In addition, if in some cases they take some issues off the political agenda entirely, they leave them to individual choice of particular citizens, and that can also facilitate foot voting in the private sector, which from an informational point of view sometimes is as good or even better than foot voting through decentralized government. Finally, if the judiciary is able to limit the number of issues on the political agenda, then at least at the margin, the voters' limited knowledge will be spread over fewer issues, and on average, they might be somewhat better informed relative to each issue than they would be otherwise. Now, none of this proves that we should just let the judges strike down whatever laws they want for whatever reason. Obviously, there are many other factors that need to be considered in a complete theory of judicial review. However, I think this does have implications for what is at least one of the most common objections to judicial review, and therefore is worth considering, even though it's not the only factor that needs to be weighed. So ultimately, I think political ignorance is a very serious problem for modern democracy. It's not one that we're likely to overcome anytime soon, at least not completely. But by empowering people more through voting with their feet, we can at least diminish the problem at the margins. And I would also suggest that there is one more possible solution to political ignorance that we might consider, which is retrieverocracy. When you have an electorate like this one, where the majority are golden retrievers, they tend to be more knowledgeable and more rational than human voters are, so that's an alternative possibility, but until we get retrieverocracy, I urge you to consider the possibility of voting with your feet, which I discuss in more detail in my book, for which I have very exciting flyers here as well. So on that note, I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.